Just checking that we're recording as well.
It's showing as recording on mine. So good to go. People are coming in.
Okay, we'll just give a couple of seconds for everybody to start joining.
Welcome if you are joining. Thank you for sharing your lunch hour with us.
Productive lunch hour as well. We'll talk about multitasking. Okay, we'll get started. So hi everybody, and thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Heather Gray. I work for Bruntwood Works, and for those of you who don't know us, we create spaces which are a really lovely blend of work and lifestyle. So we try and bring together pretty much every kind of office product that you can imagine, with retail and with hospitality in there as well, just to really try and create some truly incredible buildings, all with well-being at the heart of them. Now, our Spark programme is just one of the ways that we're trying to support businesses at the moment, and our Bruntwood Works customers as well. So over the past few months, we've been bringing together people for a range of webinars, workshops, expert advisory sessions, everything that you can imagine to try and help you guys grow and thrive. So we've been covering everything from sales and marketing to leadership, productivity, and we've got loads more coming up across November and December as well. So if you want to check out our calendar, just go to bruntwood.co.uk/Spark. So today I'm joined by one of my favourite people in Manchester's business community. We've got Kath Brown from Skillful Conversation, and she's going to be talking to us all about how do we manage those really difficult conversations. Now, I've done some training on a similar topic with Kath before, and the world felt very differently the first time around. You know, difficult conversations are incredibly anxiety inducing at the best of times, but when you think that the whole world that we're in at the moment feels anxiety inducing as well, how do we try and take the pain out of the bits that we can, really, which I think is really important to everybody's health and well-being, as well as how productive they are. And I think the current situation will mean that we're probably having all sorts of difficult conversations, whether that's at work, whether that's at home. So grab your notebook, because I'm sure there's going to be some really exciting, interesting and insightful tips from Kath, and I will pass on to you.
Thank you very much. I thought what you were going to say, Heather, was the world was a very different place last time we did this, because we were in a bar, in a restaurant with a fabulous group of women networkers, and we had dinner afterwards and we sat next to each other and it was fabulous. One day we will do that again. Welcome everybody. Thank you for joining us. I am going to share my screen and just share a few slides shortly. But before I do, I will outline, I suppose, where I'm coming from on this. I am a barrister by background, so I practiced for about just over 14 years, somewhere between 14 and 15 years in King's Chambers, which they would want me to say is Manchester, Birmingham and Leeds. I practiced in Manchester, so I'm speaking to you from there today also. I addressed courts, I addressed tribunals, judges, High Court judges, clients, clerks, all of those sorts of people. And then when I managed to escape that, which is my chosen verb for that usually, I created a company called Skillful Conversation, and I now coach and train, and I suppose I'm not brilliant at summing it up into an elevator pitch, because basically I've tried to take everything I learned from that experience and throw it into coaching and training. So sometimes I train experts or factual witnesses who want to be better at report writing, who want to be better at giving evidence in the courtroom. Sometimes I try to help lawyers understand that outside world a little bit better, and I also help busy professional people with coaching, particularly those who are getting to the point where they think they might have to go and do something else. So I try and help people stay in rather than escape. So I am going to share with you, I hope. It takes a little while to move on webinar, I find. Or does it? Maybe it's stuck. Let me stop sharing and try it again. I will try it from the non-screen show part. Hope that's not too annoying. Please do enlarge if you need to. I'm going to attempt to incorporate these three key elements into the talk today, so look out for them. I would say you could play talk bingo, but you've all got the same card there. We are going to cover how you can improve your communication and your difficult conversations with a poo emoji, a hackney cab, and a lunchbox. They all have a part to play. Heather and I thought what we'd do is try and get through most of the content up until about sort of 20 past, 25 past 2. So those of you who've got an hour will have a chance to ask a couple of questions and get on with your work days. If anybody does want to stay and discuss or debate a little bit longer, that's also absolutely fine. Feel free to type your questions in there for any stage, and Heather will keep an eye on those as we go. Sometimes what I've found when I've done this talk before is people put a question in the chat and somebody else helps them. So I do love and encourage that kind of peer-to-peer learning as well. I am going to talk a little bit later about knowing your audience and tailoring what you say to them. And I have learned since leaving the bar that not everybody knows the difference between barristers and solicitors. And I'm conscious we might have some of each on the line. So I thought I would start by explaining the difference to a certain extent. I'll explain the traditional difference. It's very different now. And actually, you will find some practitioners where they could fit very easily into either title now. But the traditional difference, often compared to a GP and consultant approach. So you would go to a GP with a primary problem, and if they needed specialist help, they would refer you to a consultant. So in the same way, solicitors are somebody you approach directly, usually. And if they need specialist advice or advocacy, they would refer it on to a barrister. So most barristers, I think, still tend to be an independent practice operating from chambers. And that's why we have, I think, more than our fair share of those difficult conversations, certainly in the workplace, because we are often the independent third party brought in to deal with a case halfway through. Somebody did say to me once, actually, that rather than that GP consultant analogy, they preferred to think of it as Formula One, which is topical this week, isn't it, with Lewis breaking his records again. And they described solicitors as being the hardworking team behind the car, designing it, sending it out speedily, and so on from the pit stops. Whereas the barrister swoops in a bit later, wearing fancy dress, and potentially takes all the glory as well as some of the blame. So I'm coming from that angle of difficult conversations. I'll try and cross-apply it, of course, to different businesses, and we'll try and apply it to some different scenarios as we go. But I've done it as 10 tips from the courtroom. So I will start by sharing tip number 1, which is beware the principal, or as we get told straight away when we start, write your closing speech first. It is, as the quote there says, very hard to tell if you've got what you want if you don't know what it is that you do want. And we get trained to write our closing speech first, before we write our questions for our witnesses, before we write our opening speech, because unless we're clear about what we want to ask that judge for, all that other work is pointless. And the reason then I have converted that to beware the principal for a wider audience is because when I'm coaching and training, I meet a lot of people who tell me it's the principal. I need to have it out with him. I've been hard done to. And what I encourage them to think about is where that's going to get them. I want you to start to think about your communication needing to have a purpose. I say needing, obviously we're not talking about dinner parties here. Probably not even your informal networking events. But what I am thinking about is those conversations that you need to have, whether it's asking your boss for more flexible working, whether it's telling your team or your company employees that you are starting a redundancy consultation, or otherwise thinking about cuts, then you need to be clear about what it is that you want to express. If you are just going in there for a rant or a moan, and I've just done some 360 feedback with some clients where people are often described as being negative. If you are just trying to get that stuff off your chest, absolutely fantastic to talk about those things. Find people you can do that with. But when you are thinking about purposeful, constructive conversation, then think about having a purpose. Little anecdote from the coaching world on that. I worked with a client who had gone through an appraisal process that had left her feeling very aggrieved. She felt like she'd been ganged up on, she'd been presented with some complaints, but there was no evidence behind it. She was fuming. She was left really, really angry at having been ambushed. She really felt like there was a hidden agenda. She felt like she hadn't had a chance to speak, and so on. And she was determined to have it out with them. And that was the expression that she kept using. And you could see that there was some stress. But a lot of people will tell me, I don't like confrontation. So even if you want to have it out with somebody, you probably only want to do it once. You probably don't want to keep having that same conversation and wondering why it's still there, why you're still stuck in that setting. So we went through why it might be pointless to just have it out with them and tell them they've been idiots and upset her and been unfair. And we worked a lot to establish what it was that she actually wanted. She wanted an apology. I have a whole different spiel about forced apologies, but it is important to some people. But we dug a little bit deeper and we found that actually she also wanted some practical solutions. She wanted to be sure that nobody else would be left feeling like this, that there would be a different process for the appraisals, that she would have notice of what she'd need to respond to, that she could perhaps take somebody in with her, some practical things. So that when she finally had it out with them, she was able to approach the conversation knowing what it was that she wanted and being able to spot when it was over and being able to spot how she would know whether she'd achieved what had been agreed in that conversation. She avoided going around in circles. She avoided having to do it again. So please do think about this. There's kind of an underrunning theme through these tips, which is that sometimes all you need to tackle these difficult conversations is a little bit of work. That's a bit of an old-fashioned principle, isn't it? That you need to put in work and commitment behind it. When you see people who appear to be naturally giving brilliant presentations or naturally engaging in those redundancy conversations or those performance management type conversations, and when you think that is effortless, you might be very surprised at how much work is in fact going on behind the scenes there. And we'll just pause there, and actually I'll just come back to the screen for a moment, just to say that to cross-apply that to a different example, this is quite a useful one to think about in terms of giving feedback. Something a lot of people shy away from, particularly if that feedback is perceived to be negative. And the risk, I think, it ties up a lot of the things I've already said. The risk is that feedback stops being feedback and it becomes a whinge or a moan or a bit hacked off. Sometimes turns into an attack on the person rather than there being a focus on the behaviour. So if you think about writing your closing speech first, if you think about avoiding the principle and having a real purpose, then you need to work out at the outset what's going on, why it's hacking you off, and what the adjustment is that you are going to require from the other person. I think it helps if you think about feedback as a corrective suggestion, to be able to leave them with a clear plan. Now, I've done what lots of people do now, fallen into my own trap of thinking only of negative feedback. I think it does apply to positive feedback as well. I think, how much more specific can you be? Rather than saying, just well done, couldn't you in fact say, that was great because? And that is something, therefore, that people will find easier to repeat. They will have a better insight into why they're getting that positive feedback if they really know where it's coming from. I think feedback's probably a whole different topic as well, but just on that, the approach I use on that is a non-violent communication conflict resolution approach. It's in a book called Non-Violent Communication by Marshall Rosenberg, and it's very focused on working out why you feel aggrieved. Not necessarily avoiding violence, because I'm sure you're all doing fine at that on your own, but it does help you work out what it is you want and how to clearly express that. I think another underlying theme, as well as the hard work, is that nobody really benefits if we dress these things up and hide them. We often need a bit of bravery to be direct. And finally, on that first tip, I suppose, is the others do get a bit quicker, but it's good to lay the groundwork, I think, is this also helps with negotiation. Negotiations go much better if you know what you want at the end, and also if you know what your bottom line is before you go in. It's when you are not so sure, and you might be able to think of some ongoing negotiations that are not going desperately well. It's when you're not so sure that the negotiations tend to drag on and not achieve what you want them to achieve. Okay, I will just share then for tip number 2. Another one, straight from the courtroom, keep your persuasive advocacy simple. Tell them what you want and tell them why they should give it to you. And again, that's how we train our pupil barristers. If you want something from your team, you want them to, I don't know, maybe work a bit harder, maybe work a bit more flexibly, maybe they want flexible working and they're coming to you to ask about that. Tell them what you want, tell them why they should give it to you. And what's not written there is you can then stop talking, at least to listen for a little bit. Don't talk them out of it by raising their objections. They will be more than capable of doing that themselves. So we'll talk later about how it's very important to be ready for those objections, but you don't have to lead with them. If we imagine that asking for more flexible working, you would present it, you would say why you want it, and we'll talk about evidence in a second. Don't then go on to say, and what you're probably thinking is, I won't be as productive, but I will because. Let them come back to you with that. They might not be thinking that at all. Probably, statistically, if you're on this call, you're unlikely to be a mind reader. So don't throw that in. Don't invite those objections. Be ready for them, but don't invite them. Keep it simple. You will note from the slide that it's much easier to tell somebody what you want if you have already worked that out. And then I will just go on to say a few words about evidence. It could be your own evidence. Can we agree that I'll work flexibly this month? And I will come back to you in a month for us to both collectively consider how productive that has been. It could be external evidence. I'm sure we could all lay our hands on a study at the moment that would tell us whether working from home has made us more efficient or not. But don't go into that conversation with, I'm going to sound like a nagger again now, with an air of entitlement. In the courtroom, you don't get things just because you want them. It is a fairly tough life lesson that we are not automatically entitled. In fact, if we take that courtroom analogy a bit further, we often will tell our clients in the run-up to a trial that they've got good prospects, and we might go so far as to say 60%, we might say 70%. But most of us would say once you walk through that courtroom door and you're left attempting to persuade a judge, you'll probably know better than 50-50, and your outcome will depend on the strength of your evidence. So it helps, I think, to approach some of these difficult conversations, particularly if it's something you want from somebody else, either higher or lower, if we're in a hierarchical scenario, helps to really think that through. And then to be able to keep it simple, and then to be able to support it by evidence rather than demanding it as your right. Tends not to work quite so well. So if I tie those up together, I've kind of used a couple of times the expression flexible working there as I was giving examples. I would say that's probably not specific enough. I think you have to think about what you mean by that. Do you mean 2 days at home, 3 in the office? Do you mean 40 hours over a 5-day week with just a couple of core hours? What is it that you mean? So better conditions, you'd need to be more specific. More flexible working, be more specific. Higher pay, be more specific. Move it to the specific, be clear about your purpose, and think about what evidence you can bring to support it. And we move away then from that feedback about our natural emotions coming out, moaning, whinging. We're moving away from the accidental towards the much more purposeful and planned. In case you're wondering, I do acknowledge that not all difficult conversations are planned, so I will try and squeeze in some tips on the non-planned ones as we go. They're harder, potentially, but there are some strategies you can deploy. Okay, tip 3. I will just pause while you have a look at that slide. You are anywhere between 2 and 6 times as likely to be released if you are one of the first 3 prisoners considered versus the last 3 prisoners considered. Now, this is not, let's get our evidence right. This is not a UK study. I am not going to defame any UK judges here. It was a study, I'll just check the data here for you, carried out in respect of 1,000 rulings by 8 judges in Israel. And it was about releasing prisoners on parole, I think, rather than bail, which we do differently also. They looked at the likelihood of a favourable ruling, i.e. will this prisoner be released, and compared it to the time of day. They considered, just because of the nature of the court day specifically, how much more likely somebody was to be released on parole if you were the first up, fresh judge, nice breakfast, had some sleep, compared to the half hour or quarter of an hour before lunch. You are anywhere between 2 and 6 times as likely to be released, as you can see there. First 3 compared to last 3. The figures declined in time from 65% to nearly 0 before the meal break, and they spiked back up to 65% after a break for a drink or a snack. So not just a full lunch break, but a small break. Now, some of you will be able to relate, I'm sure, to how well it goes when you grab your boss, who's trying to run for lunch, or your boss who's trying to get home for the weekend, or your team member who has obviously come in late, harassed because of the school run, compared to planning a time, finding a half hour, seeing when you can sit down and calmly speak to them. Of course, we are not concerned with prisoners and release in the majority of our conversations, but we can extend this, I think. I think the common sense point here that no doubt some very learned people spent a long time studying is that you can work on the environment to improve your chances of success. It's not just timings, it's how you create a favourable environment to get the result you want. Maybe persuasion, maybe a conversation ending without tears, or maybe ending with minimal tears, whatever your target is. Some of you might have been on courses over the years. I'm going back a little bit, I suppose, when you were told, you know, in a meeting room, you should never have your back to the door. That's a position of weakness. You should get people to come to you. Certainly when I started being a barrister in 1999, which is a hideously long time ago, barristers just didn't go to solicitors' offices. Everyone came to us. We sat there in our not quite ivory towers, and people came to us because it was perceived at that time was the more important. It gave them power, gave you a grand desk. Now, I think hopefully we're a bit nicer than that now in general as a society, and hopefully we can be a bit less egotistical, but let's also be a bit clever. How do we get what we want out of this conversation? Maybe going to their office. It's actually much more effective. Heather and I both walk quite frequently with a networking group, and we find that those conversations flow much more easily. You're not sitting staring eyeball to eyeball. You've got a different environment. You've got fresh air. You've got space. There's some research, actually, if you speak to any child psychologists, they'll tell you the best way to get your kid to open up is to chat to them when they're in the car. They might be behind you, but again, they have less of that confrontational feeling. They're not constantly eyeballing you. So think about what might work best. Time, setting, maybe even what you wear. And I don't mean this in some awful kind of 70s way, but I do mean it in what makes you feel confident, what makes you feel good. You know, we often hear in times of economic depression about the increase in sales of lipsticks and so on, don't we? Because there are quick, cheap ways to make some of us feel a bit better. So do give this some thought. Don't just, what a lot of people do, I find, is they put conversations off if they perceive them to be difficult. And having put them off, silence also has a consequence. That's another favourite saying of mine. Often they blurt it out, and they blurt it out in the worst possible circumstances. So it is better, I think, to be brave and to plan if you want to improve your results. Let's cross-apply this principle for a moment and think about public speaking, giving presentations, that type of work that studies constantly tell us is the scariest kind of work, that people have phobias about. And think about how you can make that better. Not every talk has to be a TED Talk. Even if you are not speaking into a Zoom camera, you can have that, deliver that talk sitting down, perhaps. Perhaps you would feel better behind a lectern, and it gives you something to hold on to if there's a bit of a shake. Maybe something to hide part of you behind. I always compare the audience at public speaking to being a bit like dogs in that they can sense fear. And I think the much better way to approach that type of work, if it is something that scares you, is to attempt to reframe it as fun. What are you going to get out of it? You're going to meet some amazing people. Very few people attend a talk or a webinar intending to be critical or hoping that they will be bored or not entertained. Most people attend with goodwill for the speaker. So if you can remember that, get your confident lipstick on and have a setting which suits you, then that's a fear also that I think you can start to work at. I will concede also that practice does help with this. So there is a little bit about being brave. I'm spoiling my last slide. My last slide is about being brave, but there's a little bit about that, I think. Practice definitely does help. Okay, I think it's time to get to the Beatles. Who are the Beatles? I will hear you cry. This tip, let me just attempt to share that for you. This tip is about knowing your audience and tailoring your content so that you can be both clear and direct. Here, I can tell you that the Beatles, along with the Teletubbies, along with Linford Christie's Lunchbox, which some of you might be old enough to remember, and also along with the bank, Monzo, all have the distinction of being in the category of people or things that have caused judges to say, who or what is that? Who are the Beatles? That's the one I can't actually, I'm afraid to say, can't get beyond urban myth. I can't find the source for that. Although the answer has also slipped into urban myth, that the judges or the barrister responding to the judge is believed to have replied that they are a popular beat combo, my lord, when asked who the Beatles were at the height of their fame. One of the things I think if you want to excel in communication that you can take from these barristers is that you need to address this audience, not your imaginary one, not the one you'd like to be addressing. You need to address this audience. So rather than giving you the specific Linford Christie lunchbox example, let's turn instead to Gaza. And the Paul Gascoigne example is an interesting one because it went a little bit further than thinking about your audience. You had to think 2 steps ahead in this one. Counsel who was representing Paul Gascoigne in an action before the court, I think it was a libel case. The Linford Christie one was about biography. I think the Paul Gascoigne one was about a newspaper. The barrister presenting to the High Court judge had evidently considered, maybe this judge won't know who Paul Gascoigne is. There may be people on this webinar who don't know who Paul Gascoigne is. He was a very famous footballer, and he is no longer a very famous footballer, but does still appear in the popular press quite frequently. So the barrister had obviously thought this through, thought I better explain who Paul Gascoigne is. I better not assume knowledge on the part of this judge. So he opened by saying, Mr. Gascoigne is a very well-known footballer. And the judge, who was determined to maintain his ivory tower reputation, it was a he in that case, said, rugby or association football? Clearly wishing to maintain what may have been a facade, it may have been true that he didn't know who this person before him was. He later said, isn't there an operetta called La Gaza Ladra? I don't know the answer to that. He probably knows more about that than I do. So questions can be quite powerful. But the better tip for us, I think, to take away from this is how do you get your message across in language and terminology that other people understand? And even if, like that very hardworking barrister, trying to anticipate the problem, even if you don't get it right first time, as long as you've thought about it, you will be able to respond to that question. You will be able to reach a level where you are communicating effectively with the right audience. Not with the one that you want, but the one that you actually have in front of you. Please be aware, both in written and spoken communication, about abbreviations, about jargon, about thinking everybody will know that word because it's been used in your industry for 5 years. They might not know that. That's why I've learned to start by explaining what barristers do. You want to get away, I think, from having that certain arrogance. I did train some nurses recently on record keeping, which is another way of training people to anticipate dealing with lawyers. And one of them said to me, I think abbreviations are elitist because they stop people understanding you. And that is evidently not what you want. You want people to understand you as much as possible. So think about where you pitch it, think about your language. If you are doing, for example, a technical presentation, think about whether visual aids might help you. I should say, I always feel like I should end this section with just a word of defence of judges, just in case. I don't think there'll be any online, but yeah, there might be children of judges on the line, partners of judges on the line, and they're not quite as cut off from real life as those examples would suggest. I think actually they spend their working days being surrounded by the worst of humanity, and seeing, you know, very difficult disputes, horrendous crimes, and so on. But they do occasionally just hit the press for the wrong reasons, as could happen to any of us. Okay, so a few foundations there, hopefully, and a few quicker tips to come now. We've got purpose, we've got a simple evidence-based approach with some thought being given to setting and language. And let us turn then to those objections. I've said don't lead with the objections. I stand by that. I stand by, tell them what you want and why they should give it to you. But that is not where your preparation ends. You do need to be ready to be grilled in certain circumstances. You know, if you are telling the team that there are cuts to be made, they will have questions. And you might think that the fair and decent thing to do is to be able to answer them. Equally, if you are asking for a concession, perhaps back to the flexible working, concession from your boss, your employer, they'll want to know why they should give it to you. They'll want to know what's in it for them. They want to know if you've thought it through. So anticipate, so you can deal with them if they arise. What questions are you likely to face? How would you respond? How can you offer them some comfort? How can you show that you are taking their concerns seriously, that you haven't come in there with that air of entitlement? And I said I would mention along the way what you do with the unplanned difficult conversations. And this is probably quite a timely point to do that, because the unplanned conversations, when somebody comes up to you and says, I need to speak to you because, can we have 5 minutes? Because I need you to fix X, I'm not happy about Y. How do you deal with that? You might think, well, I can't prepare. How could I possibly prepare for that? But I think you can. I think you can work on having a toolkit for that if you want to improve your communication. So think about what is your theme, I suppose, and I don't mean that in a good way. Do you immediately lose your temper? Does your voice go a bit shaky? That used to be one of mine. Do you go a bit red here? That can sometimes happen to me also. Do you forget your words? Do you repeat yourself? What is it that if you worked on it, practiced it, got some feedback from it, put yourself into some difficult situations and practice, what is it that could improve that? Do you tend, and I've invented a verb for this, do you tend to politician when people ask you difficult questions? When somebody says to you, will the vaccine be available in December? Do you say, well, thank you very much for asking me about the vaccine. We have spent £5 million with the German company. I didn't ask you that. I asked you, will we be able to get it by a certain date? You know, when people dance around, you know, when they hedge around, it doesn't help. So you want to be able to practice being calm, and then to be able to be direct in your phrasing. And it helps just to have some stock phrases. You know, even the best barristers will have some stock phrases. If our witness has behaved disastrously in the witness box, if they've agreed with absolutely everything that the opposing barrister has said, if they have lost their own case for you, then what we tend to say in closing is not, please forget everything they've said. We tend to say something like, my lord, I will concede that Mr. Smith was not a sophisticated witness. I'm conveying in neutral tones, in a language they will understand, something in a temperate voice that will allow me to go on and make some further submissions. I'm addressing a difficult point and I'm being able to move on. For you, it might be something as simple as being able to say, I will need to get back to you on that. You might want to add in, thank you very much for approaching me with this problem. I can't unfortunately address it immediately, but I will get back to you as soon as possible. Or even better, because specific is better, could we speak about this on Friday instead? That, I think, is a much more helpful way of coping with somebody approaching you with a difficult problem, has much more honesty, much more integrity than fobbing them off and giving them a media politician type answer. So think about temperate phrasing. That's an expression, by the way, I should just give a credit for that. Temperate phrasing is an expression from an author called Holly Weeks in a book called Failure to Communicate, How Conversations Go Wrong and What You Can Do to Right Them. So do think about, there will be scenarios where you're uncomfortable. What do I need in my toolkit to be able to address that? Not to hide under the desk, but to be able to cope with it fairly in the future. Okay. I will just move on then to our few final tips. I'm conscious of the time. I will hopefully stop talking somewhere around 20 past or 25 past so that you can fire questions at me. Slightly different point on preparation. A lot of what we've already said applies to preparation, doesn't it? Thinking about what you need, thinking about where to have the conversation, thinking about the evidence you can deploy, thinking about having a toolkit ready. I did want to just stress that underlying theme about hard work here. I did coach somebody in a firm in Manchester, and he did literally say to me, this was quite a high risk assignment, because he literally said to me, my boss, that director over there, he just walks in, he just does all this naturally. And the reason I talk too much, which was the problem there, the reason I talk too much is because I find it harder than he does. And I said, and this is where the risk comes in, I said, well, I think you should speak to him, because I'm not sure he does just do that naturally. I think he probably puts some work in. And I crossed my fingers and I hoped, and thankfully, predictably, I would like to say, his director said, yep, I've worked really hard. I've prepped it. I've thought about it. I've thought about how to make it simple. And I've even thought about how to appear natural. What I haven't done is just walked in and blagged it. So some of it's hard work, some of it is practice. My most extreme example of preparation, I'll just give him a bit of a credit, it's no longer with us sadly, but my former head of chambers was the most senior criminal judge in Manchester for a while, but he started his practice in the planning world. And he had a reputation, and again, I don't know if this gets beyond urban myth, but he allegedly worked out how to cross-examine a witness by working out question one, working out all the possible answers, and then working out all the possible question twos, and then working out all their possible answers, and then working out all the possible question threes. I just don't know how you get on that on paper. It was well before things like electronic whiteboards and so on. But he approached it in that way so that he was prepared. I think another way to look at this actually is to think about the practice, and this is one of my favourite universal tips actually. It will improve almost everything you do, especially everything you do in terms of communication, is getting into a habit of reflection, of thinking about what worked well. He found that worked well for him, so he kept doing it. What I found worked well for me was not even to write down questions, but to write down topics, because I found that helped me be more responsive to the witness in front of me. So think about conversations you've had, perhaps after dreading them, perhaps after putting them off. Think about how they went well. Think about the ones that have gone badly, and see if you can find a common theme and work on that. We get told as pupil barristers we should be the person in the room that knows the most about the case, and I think it is good to aim high in terms of your preparation. Here is the esteemed Bart Simpson telling you that very little improves with repetition. And again, this is where the bar advocates generally, I think, depart from your TED Talk scenario, where you might be told to have 3 things you say at the beginning, repeat them later on. You might be told, tell them what you're going to say it, then tell them what you've said. That might work for some things, actually. I'm not saying completely dismiss that. I'm saying that there's a difference between giving a TED Talk and having a conversation with a busy individual. And I suppose one way of looking at it is your points, your clarity and your evidence should be strong enough so that you don't need to keep repeating what it is that you've said. You want to keep their interest. You want to save them time, or at least look like you care about their time. And if, as I think many of those sort of public speaking trainers say, that the repetition is for them to be able to understand, then you can check that in other ways. I would encourage you as listeners to people to check your understanding, to repeat back perhaps what you've heard. And if you're the one that is trying to get a difficult point across, then I would encourage you to check in at regular points to see if they're following you. Maybe have a few well-chosen questions so that you can check whether they have actually followed, and so on. But I really think you will strongly improve your conversations if you learn to value people's time. And this ties in very nicely with the next slide. We do then get to the poo emoji. I think this was first told to me by the judge I just mentioned, actually, who does his tree diagrams for questions, or did, sadly. And this is if you imagine a plate and somebody's presenting to you a fabulous donut or a piece of cake on this wonderful plate. Isn't it wonderful? Wouldn't it just be lovely to have it? Are there any circumstances in which it would be improved by having some horse manure, let's say, next to it? Or dog poo? Or any other kind? That, I would suggest, is immediately going to ruin your appetite. So know when to stop. You don't improve your good points by littering them, by padding them, surrounding them with bad points. You should know, of course, by now what your good points are. You should be able to focus in on them. You should be able to hone them, and so on. So if you've got that winning point, you're going to persuade the jury, your client should go free. Know when to stop. I think also, I suppose, particularly if you're thinking about presentations or a formal sort of structured meeting, do think about when you deploy your best point as well. Again, that beautiful piece of cake will be less attractive after a very heavy meal. And I think sometimes there is a bravery in knowing when to stop. subclause for that, as I follow my own advice, is think about quality, not quantity. Okay. We've said a lot about speaking. We've said a lot about planning what we say. Don't underestimate the power of listening. I think the vast majority of people end up in the waiting to speak zone instead of the listening zone. Communication should be a two-way process. If you ignore the audience, you are speaking into a void, which actually Zoom webinar is a little bit like, isn't it? But you can see the numbers. Numbers have held up relatively well, I think. In general, keep an eye on people, see if they are listening. And when we think about all the things we've talked about, people approaching us approaching them, us finding the right environment, this only works if we collectively are prepared to listen. If there's anybody on here who's already connected with me on LinkedIn, you will have seen I was very giddy over the summer because I got to ask a question to Tim Peake, Major Tim Peake, I should say, who was the British astronaut who went to the International Space Station, and he was at a conference, and the Zoom questioner from the UK let them down. So I had to dive in last minute and ask him a question. Obviously, I went with an on-brand question. So I asked him about being on the International Space Station with an international team, different languages being spoken, different standards, life, death, stuff like that being on the line. What was his top tip for communication? And without prompting him, without giving him a fiver or anything like that, his answer was to listen. And he assured me that the training they went through was what they worked on was very much their listening. They constantly put them in scenarios where, you know, as very bright, very capable people, they would have their own ideas, but they would force them, I think, to listen to the others and realise how fabulous those other opinions were if they did stop to listen. So don't underestimate that power. If you have to slow down, fine. Slow down, give that time for listening. So we've done the lunchbox, we've done the poo emoji. Our last picture on the bingo card is the Hackney cab. And this is the Be Brave tip. This is, for the non-lawyers in the room, a reference to the cab rank rule, which is a rule that is in the Barrister's Code of Conduct. Without originality, it's still called the cab rank rule. They've stolen it, though, from the Hackney cab licence, which says to people, if you have your light on, if somebody flags you down, you have to take them to where they want to go if they pay you the right amount of money. And similarly, in the barrister world, if you receive some instructions, you have to do them. There are very few exceptions. So you have to be competent in the field, you have to be paid a proper fee, etc. But if you've ever wondered why people represent people accused of terrorism, or murder, or rape, it's because their code of conduct has removed their choice. And the other thing you need to know about barristers is you can qualify to be a barrister more quickly than you can to be a solicitor. People sometimes think we are more qualified or that you have to do one before the other, but that is not true. So that you have to stand up, you have to say it, you have to do it. That applies to our 21, 22-year-old, 22, I think is probably the youngest you can be unless you go to uni earlier. And they have to do it. And the best way to think about this, I think, apart from that dog reference and people sensing fear, so I've already said, you know, push yourself, try and be in that zone. The best way, I think, to motivate yourself in this sense is to try and think about what was worrying you last November. Can you even properly articulate what was worrying you at this time on this day last week? These things disappear. They do disappear. And I would therefore strongly encourage you to be brave. I would also encourage you to be kind to yourself. So maybe don't go straight for the TED Talk. Maybe build up a little bit. Maybe get some help from friends or trainers along the way. But if you need a further incentive to be brave, I would mention just once again that silence has a consequence. It really does. And if you're feeling stuck, if you're putting things off, then imagine that 22-year-old fresh out of uni, you're forced to stand up there and say things. And if they can do it, I'm a big, big believer that you can as well, while still being kind to yourself. And Heather appears as if by magic. Welcome back, Heather.
Oh, that was fantastic, Kath. Thank you so much. And yeah, such a lovely note to end on is to be more brave. And you're 100% right in that the conversations are never as bad as you think that they're going to be. I don't know about you, but I always build things up in my head. So we do have a couple of minutes left for some questions. So if you do have any, please just pop them in either the Q&A box or the chat box, either of which is absolutely fine. My question, I've got one to start us off while people are thinking and typing them, is the thing that I always worry about when I'm going to have a difficult conversation is what if the other person gets emotional, whether that's upset, whether it's that they get angry. Are there any tips on how best to diffuse that situation so that, because you can't get your points across if somebody's crying or shouting, that's pointless.
No, you can't. And I think one of the funny enough, the funny thing about that, Heather, is that comes up almost every time I run this as a workshop.
Okay.
Webinar. So I think it does happen, and I think it's right to think about it. And I think they are different. I think it, I would say this being a personal injury barrister by background, I think if it's aggression, if it's temper, then I'm very much in a safety first kind of zone. And I think if that's the scenario, there's nothing wrong with just pausing and stopping and getting yourself to a different place and picking that conversation up at a further point. I think if the other person's upset, the best thing I ever learned, and I learned it by accident because somebody really thanked me for doing it, and I'd done it because I was clueless, is just to let them get it out. If people want to, if people, it's brought something up for somebody that perhaps you couldn't anticipate, perhaps you could, then get it out and be your usual kind self. If you would normally offer them a drink of water, or if you would normally offer them some time, brilliant. If you can just listen, brilliant. And again, offer them, I think, the opportunity to pick up the serious part of the conversation later if they want to. Some people would rather get it finished.
Okay.
I think to give them the option is a good idea.
Brilliant. So just respond as you would and then look at either shelving it or dealing it there and then.
Yeah, absolutely. I think
that's
so.
Good to know, because I think it's that's as well as almost the worry in advance as to, well, what do I do if this happens? So it's just having those tips and tricks handy at your disposal. We've got another question from one of our attendees who's asked about communication within the workplace. So specifically, it's when maybe a staff member is underperforming, but maybe they're a little bit stubborn with their way of doing things. They're not the sort of person that will change. Have you got any tips on how to address that? So, and I think this is probably something that we can see in all sorts of conversations, and apply to other things outside of work as well. It's how do you have those conversations with somebody that you think doesn't want to listen?
I think, it's going to happen, isn't it? We do live in a world of free will and freedom of speech and all that kind of thing. And unless you're going to go down a structured employment law, not my field, type of route, then you have to find a way to work with it to a certain extent, I think. What I usually recommend to people is, rather than building it up into difficult conversation after difficult conversation, the better, it's a slightly longer term approach, I will concede. But I think the more effective approach is to have a genuine culture of feedback and reflection, so that you're not just doing this at a 6-month or 12-month appraisal and meeting resistance because people are then naturally defensive. And I think it's a really good area to lead by example. Can you say to your team, How did that work out? How did that having that morning meeting by Zoom work out? Did it go well? Or we've now finished that difficult project. What can I do next time to be better at that? And I think it's chipping away, because what you want is people to get to a position where they welcome feedback, and that is hard, where they welcome being able to grow and change. And people are quite resistant to the reality of change. They might change a little bit. Martin Murphy, another of our colleagues, often says people change a lot to stay in the same place. So people are a bit scared by transformation sometimes. And I think often when we're asking people to change in the workplace, we ask them to change, but we don't always train them or give them support to do that. So if you feel like they're stuck in the ways, maybe that's as much as they're capable of without further input and support.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you, Kath. And so potentially a last question, unless anyone else pops in with one, but have you got any tips for people pleasers? So if, for example, you come in and you are having a potentially difficult conversation and you know what you want out of it, but maybe you come against somebody who is a little bit more assertive in the way that they speak and think, how do you make sure that you stick to your guns?
That's a good one, isn't it? I thought you were going to say then, and I'll just deal with this very quickly because it comes up a lot as well, is saying yes without thinking about it, because that's
okay.
a lot of people pleasers do. And I think the thing to do with that, and we could probably cross-apply it as well, is just to count to 3 before you say anything.
Okay.
Because then you can think about, actually, it doesn't have to be a yes. You don't have to keep giving yeses. I think on the assertiveness point, if you're not getting somebody somewhere, then maybe check in with yourself, think, have I brought forward my best evidence? Have I persuaded them? Have I produced the chocolate cake piece yet? Maybe ask them a question. Maybe ask them, what would it take for you to be able to see it in this way, or for us to be able to make this next change? So try and open the dialogue a little bit rather than it being two stated positions that are just clashing.
Yeah.
There's somewhere that we can meet. And sometimes check in with whether you're listening. You know, are they being stubborn about it all, or is there just one little point that you might be able to move it? And I think actually that genuinely, that counting to 3, if you were at the point of just going, yeah, it's too hard, I'm just going to do it their way, then again, just rein yourself back in for 3. And if you need to, do the adjournment rain check policy, I think.
That's fantastic. Thank you so much, Kath. Well, I feel like I've learned loads from that, and I also feel quite fearless now. So if I have any difficult conversations, I'm going to go and tackle them head on and be brave. But I'll make sure that I try and do it at the right time, that I'm in the right headspace, and that I plan in advance what I want out of them.
You've got your bravery headband on.
Got my bravery headband on. So thank you so much, Kath. That was absolutely brilliant. And what I'll do is I'll make sure that everybody that is on the webinar will receive a follow-up email that will also have some of your details on. So if people want to get in touch with you following the event, you know, please feel free to do so. I'll pop your LinkedIn details and everything like that on as well.
Yeah, always happy to answer emails as well if we didn't get to you, or if you're a little bit shy, then yeah, feel free to just drop me an email or connect on LinkedIn.
Oh, that's wonderful. Thank you, Kath. And thank you to you too, everybody, for watching. Really enjoyed having you here today. Don't forget to check out www.bruntwood.co.uk/spark to see which upcoming webinars that we have. We've got loads of workshops coming up, everything from managing public speaking. We're trying to connect different networkers across our key cities as well. So Manchester, Liverpool, Leeds and Birmingham, we're looking at bringing it together and getting everybody to share networks, connections and ideas. So lots coming up this month. Check it out soon and have a happy and healthy week, everybody. Thank you very much. Goodbye.
Thank you.